Hello from London and welcome to this session of WAF Futures. We're discussing social equity and the role of architects and architecture and designers in creating it, or helping to create it, or aspiring to create it. Jeremy Melvin, curator at World Architecture Festival, is here in the studio, of course. And our special guest for this session, welcome to Vicky Richardson, who is Head of Architecture at the Royal Academy here in London and the Heinz Curator at the RA. If I can have the first slide, I'm just going to show a couple of images. This is a project which caught the judge's eye when we were going through all the future project entries looking for a winner for this particular category. This is by Boogutman, the South African practice, and this project is an attempt to stitch together two very different parts of, I think it's Johannesburg, isn't it, Jeremy? Through a kind of what they call a living mesh, so a combination of building, social amenity and landscape, to try and remove a state of kind of extreme inequality in terms of both the wealth of the residents, but also the amenities that they may enjoy. And there's a kind of a diagram of what it is that they're trying to do. But the winner of this, of the prize this year, and congratulations to them, are KPMB and Two Row Architects, Canadian practices, and this we thought was a wonderful project. It's creating a housing type, a resilient duplex for the First Nation at Fort Seven, so this is kind of native Canadians, if I can call them that. And of course the recent really tragic revelations about the treatment of First Nation children in particular, that's caused so much political controversy, has set the context for this, although it hadn't actually arisen at the time we looked at this. So we're not trying to pick something because it relates to headlines that are in the papers. We picked it because we thought it was a great project. And I'm going to now pass over to Shirley Bloomberg and Brian Porter to present the project, after which we'll have some discussion, no doubt about the project itself. We might have some questions, but also to look at the some of the issues which projects like this raise for architecture. Over to you guys and welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Well, it's morning here, eh, Shirley?
Yes, good morning, everyone. So Brian's going to start, and then I'm going to follow.
Yeah, I wanted to, I'm really glad for the opportunity to talk today about this project that I consider to be, very modest and straightforward. And I wanted to start with a few slides to just set the political context for it. Next, please, Shirley. So First Nations in Canada have kind of avoided centralizing our governments. A lot of the communities are still locally controlled and consider themselves sovereign, but there is a centralized voice in Ottawa. And you're looking at a photograph of Perry Bellegarde, who is the national chief of the Assembly of First Nations. And I'll just give you a second to read that quote that he's making there. I won't read it for you. But what I think it does, I think it really describes well the notion that housing is intertwined with everything else in a community. Having a safe, stable, affordable home is the platform that allows families to focus on thriving in all other areas of their life. And I think it's really the same for Indigenous peoples, all over the world. Some of our challenges, are being experienced in all parts of the world. But we'll take a look at this northern example. Next, please. So this sort of describes a little bit, of the background. If there are a little over 36 million people in Canada, the Indigenous population is 1.67 million. That equates to about 44.9% of the population. And I'll point to the 32 median age there. We're a young population. We're growing at a rate that's something like 2.5 times the birth rate that the rest of Canada is experiencing. There are 637 First Nation communities in Canada, and those are represented by the yellow dots that you see there on the map. There are also 53 Inuit communities that you can see represented by the blue dots. And across the continent, there are about 70 Indigenous languages that are spoken. And if you compare this, sorry, Shirley, if you compare this, most Canadians live along the U.S. border in cities like Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg, and Vancouver. So when you talk about northern communities in Canada, you're talking about Indigenous communities. Next, please. This talks about some of the challenges that are typical to most of these remote communities that we saw in the previous map. Housing is overcrowded. It's not built to last, and a lot of times it's designed through a southern lens, and maybe the insulation is thickened up. That's usually the way these houses get situated. And their poor quality really contributes to poor health, obviously with indoor air requirements not being great. It also contributes to poor education, where a child really has no place to kind of even sit down and do their homework. And given the growth rate and the lack of core funding, and really the lack of core funding, to my mind, comes from some of the treaties that were signed between Indigenous communities in Canada really anticipated resource sharing, and those are not being honored by Canada. So that lack of core funding really results in a chronic housing shortage, really all across the country. Next, please. Our host this morning talked about some of these new revelations that are in the news, where a lot of these grave sites there were 139 residential schools in Canada to date. Yeah, five of these school sites have been examined, and yeah, it's hard to talk about this, but I think the point that we wanted to try to make by showing this is that the program of assimilation has really had an impact on housing as well, and a lot of the housing was designed because it wasn't supposed to be, the communities weren't supposed to be there. They were all designed on a short-term basis. There was no investment made in infrastructure. So that's sort of contributed to the quality of the communities and kind of the lack of investment that's been made there. So like I say, only 5 of the 139 school sites have been analyzed for this. So we're just really kind of seeing the tip of the iceberg here. Sorry. I knew this slide was going to be a tough one, but past it now. So next, please.
Next.
It was interesting. We wanted to just sort of talk a little about the federal government started a commission back in 2008 to take a look at Indigenous communities in Canada, to look at some of the political, financial issues that were impacting them. And they came out with a report in 2015 that had 94 calls to action. And so that report came out in 2015, and I remember Shirley calling me up around 2017 to say, we really need to do something about this. So back in 2017, we started to have meetings where we talked about, the challenges, the opportunities, what could we do as architects to help, the quality of life in these communities. So this partnership really came about, in quite an earnest way. Next, please. And then in 2019, the National Research Council of Canada asked for a prototype design to be developed that could be rubber stamped across Canada. And of course, the Indigenous architectural community, we resisted. Rather, we proposed that 5 teams be deployed to 5 different communities to work intimately with them to arrive at 5 community-based solutions. We were assigned one of those sites, which became an extension of the research work that we started in 2017. So it was great that we had a chance to execute some of the work that we had been talking about previous to this contract award. Next, please. I wanted to take the next 10 slides or so just to talk about the location context. So here we are. You can see the Fort Severn community on the shore of Hudson's Bay at the mouth of the Severn River. The little airplanes there show what it takes to get there. It's a flight from Toronto to Thunder Bay. A smaller plane goes from Thunder Bay to Sioux Lookout. And then when you get to Sioux Lookout, you jump on Really, which is like an 8-seater that takes you from Big Trout Lake and then into the community. And we've added a line of latitude there and listed some of the other cities in the world that you might be more familiar with than Fort Severn, like Reykjavik, Oslo, Glasgow. So you can kind of get a sense about how far north this community is. It is kind of interesting that it's located about about 2/3 of Canada still remains north of Fort Severn. So it's interesting when you talk to Canadians, their concept of the North really probably stops at Thunder Bay. They don't really, a lot of them don't really have an appreciation for just how deep the country is. So that's where we were. Next. A little bit about the historic context. The community would have been largely semi-nomadic. They would have done a lot of fishing in the fall. There would have been a lot of land-based hunting for most parts of the year. So what we're showing here is a picture of an askagan, which is it's a half-buried log and moss dwelling that would have been seasonal housing. And we were in the community, speaking to some of the elders. Many of them, really fondly recall that traditional architecture that was the way they were born and raised. Starting in about the 1950s, as demonstrated by the photograph on the right there, you can see the types of Western architecture that was imposed on the community, largely by the federal government. Next, please. I love some of these pictures. They're really intended to kind of show what the traditional life was like. Really largely living on the land, having your lifestyle really fine-tuned to the seasons. It's interesting. You can see the fellow there, fishing with the gill net in the largest picture there. And what he's really doing is he's taking advantage of the tidal waters in the Severn River that rise and fall by quite a bit. They still fish using, this method today. At this time of the year, the water level in the Severn River fluctuates by over a meter. So again, they're kind of working with their local context to sustain themselves. Next, please. This is an aerial shot taken, and you can kind of see the community there in the upper right-hand corner. The landscape could really be described as flat. It's quite boggy. It's very close to the end of the tree line. It's kind of interesting that the tree line is starting to move a little bit north with global warming, and the community, sustains itself by having winter ice roads where goods can be transported from Sioux Lookout up to James Bay. They really kind of rely on those roads, and with global warming, those roads are becoming a lot less reliable. So they're going to be faced with some pretty significant challenges going forward as those roads become, the season for those roads becomes shorter and shorter. Next, please. These are a few pictures from the site visits that we conducted in 2019, and this gives you kind of a sense of the stunted tree growth that you see there. Again, as I was saying, we're right near the end of the tree line. The picture with the shoes on the ground there, if you stand in one spot for 10 or 20 seconds, you can feel the water start to accumulate under your feet. So it's very boggy. We were there in June, and you can still see ice on the banks of the river in that photograph, on the bottom left-hand side. So it's really, you really feel the sense of the community all across the calendar year. This slide shows the community. You can see the airport strip in the upper right-hand side, and you can see, the houses that are located, along the river. The community gets its electricity from diesel generators, but kind of, in a testament to their, willingness to be, innovative, they've just installed a solar farm that is going to have the capacity to address about 50% of their electricity needs, during the summer. So I think it speaks to their resilience and their willingness to be contemporary, find contemporary solutions that really kind of align with their Indigenous values. Next, please. This shows you a little bit of context of the town, itself, and you can see that the town largely parallels the river. Some of the oldest homes that are sort of in the core of the town were occupied in the 1970s, and they were fairly sort of standard kind of Western bungalows, and some of the newer housing, you can sort of see that strip in the upper right corner. So they're starting to develop these tracts, and they're all of the houses are owned by the community. There's no private ownership. So the children really kind of they wander through the town without fences, without any really markings of any kind of like individual property. It's really quite an interesting sort of mosaic that you experience when you visit this place. Next, please. This picture is taken from the balcony of the hotel, which is the only two-story building in town. That's where we stayed when we went there. So I think it's interesting. It really sort of describes the landscape. This is pretty typical, but it also demonstrates sort of the reliance on heavy equipment to build and maintain roads, to do excavations. So there's really, it's got some rough edges to it for sure. Next, please. These are some shots from some of the 1970s, 1980s, stock housing that was built, that really, imported designs from the South. They're not holding up very well. The durability isn't there. Um, and you can see really just how little sort of positive outdoor space that there is. People need to get close to their front doors in the winter time, so there are a lot of vehicles kind of that get right up to the front door, but certainly not a lot of positive outdoor space. Next, please. One of the things that we were really taken by was the prevalence of these structures that they build, where they smoke caribou, they smoke geese, they smoke fish. So it really harkens back to some of the traditional uh, lifestyles that they had there. And there's a central fire. The smoke rises up through the hole in the middle, and they're really beautifully crafted. Um, they really take pride in the way that these structures are put together. They emulate some beautiful light at night. And I would say probably every second or third house had one of these structures in its in vicinity to its front door. Um, we when we went there, we conducted a lot of community engagement. So that the next slide, really try to speak to that. We met with the elders, we met with the youth, we met with their current construction crews, and it really feels like they're doing a good job with a lot of it. They've come up with this geodetic sort of space frame uh, to provide foundations for their houses. So what they'll do is they'll excavate about 6 or 8 feet of the bog material out. They'll come back in with compacted granulars to form this base, and then they'll lay down this space frame that they build their housing on top of, and that they've managed to really stabilize the conditions by using that kind of technique. It's a foundation that they can climb underneath and level when they need to make adjustments from season to season. So they're really kind of doing a good job at addressing some of the problems that they had with the housing styles that were imported from the West. They're starting to construct them themselves with their own crews. They're starting to go back and also retrofit some of the houses from the 70s and the 80s that have found their way into the community. So they're quite hopeful, I think, with where they're at. And really, we kind of saw our work not kind of reinventing a new language, but really we kind of saw it as an extension of some of what they're currently doing. Next, please. So this is a slide showing us, working with the youth. The children were wonderful. They were a lot of fun working with the elders. And so I think that was our main takeaway from these sessions. We tried to do them in a fairly open, transparent manner. We tried our best to listen. 95% of the time, we would lead them with questions, but it was really about trying to collect the community voice and trying to understand where we could take the housing typologies to help them create a better standard of living, but really building on the work that they've been doing over the last few years. So I'll turn it over to Shirley to speak to some of the specifics of our design.
Thank you, Brian. So the design strategies came out of the consultation process with the community, and were really founded on what we understand to be Indigenous ways of knowing. The first one was incredibly important to the community. Indigenous people have a very profound connection to the land, and the community in Fort Severn felt this was really missing from their housing, and that was something that was really very, very high on their list of requirements. Then the next was to design a resilient community, and resilience in terms of social structure, resilience in terms of flexibility and adaptability, durability, and also in terms of adapting to climate change. Brian actually expressed the next strategy like this: to work in alignment with natural forces, again, fundamental to Indigenous ways of knowing. So we focused on designing in harmony with the wind, the sun, the elements, and the seasons to connect with daily and seasonal cycles. And then extreme climate conditions and the logistics of getting materials and supplies up to Fort Severn is extremely difficult. They have a barge that comes twice a year, an ice road that is rapidly reducing in numbers of days every year, and then fly in. So we developed with our building science and energy engineers a high performance envelope as close to passive house as possible. We designed the building specifically because the local crews were used to building stick frame. We designed it as wood stick frame construction, flat pack that could be transported on a barge or an ice road as economically as possible. The last one is something I think as architects around the world we can all learn from. Indigenous people plan for 7 generations. So we really wanted to invest in homes that would last in terms of their technical performance, environmental and social sustainability, and most important, be culturally relevant and adaptable. These are the archetypes that Brian had mentioned before that were most striking to us. And on the right was the oldest house, I think it was from the 50s in the town. It's abandoned, but it had the most beautiful silvered wood exterior. And we thought that was probably made from what they call the tamarack or larch forest that surrounds Fort Severn. So we were very interested in the question of, could we capture something of each of these archetypes as inspiration for the design so that we could engender these buildings to be somehow of this place. This is a rendering, daytime rendering, of the cluster of housing that we designed. There were 2 typologies that could be combined into a duplex, and combined in different ways. This shows them as duplex. One was a small unit for elders housing, and then a larger unit for a young family. This idea of connection to the land was very important to the design. We designed around the wood stoves that are used all the time. Therefore, we had to have galvanized metal roofs. We speculated that really you could use any exterior cladding, but here, hopefully, they would use the larch shingles. So you have this kind of silver color to the houses, and then bring actual color at the entrances and porches. So we are proposing to build a cluster of 12 units, framing a shared landscape. This is a diagram. On the left, in yellow, you see the elders' apartment, which has solar panels on the roof. And on the right, a family unit, which is taller because it has a flexible loft. They're both on these foundations that Brian was talking about, and raised walkways, and a shared entry porch. Here you can see the sections that show how those space frame foundations work. On the left is a section through the elders' apartment, and on the right through the young family's apartment. And it has that flexible loft that could be used in many ways. This is, the plan was incredibly, very, very tightly planned, and planned to be highly flexible and adaptable. On the right-hand side, you could see how these units can be combined in different ways. Even though we had to plan this very, very tightly for affordability, we wanted to design with a huge amount of generosity and offer people freedom and choice in the way that they lived, and specific to northern community functional needs. So there's a shared porch. There are entry mudrooms, which are very large because of all the ice, the huge ice boxes, and all the outdoor equipment and shoes, etc., etc., etc. And they could also be, the elders have a porch at the back of their unit, and the family has outdoor space on the front of their unit. And they have horrible black fly problems in the summer, so we also thought that they could add screening to that and actually be able to sit outside, which is not really possible at the moment. And then upstairs, this idea of that flexible loft. A lot of people, the homes form the kind of social centers for gatherings, and quite often there are people that stay over. As this young family expands, or multi-generational families, you could add bedrooms and bathrooms and so on. So a great deal of flexibility. So this was really important. The site plan is very, very different than the suburban model that Brian showed you that exists right now. So we were proposing clusters. These are 2 clusters of houses that are all accessible via this raised walkway, wood walkway, and fully accessible as well in terms of disabled accessibility and so on. And it provided shared communal space for the houses and created some kind of an idea about a community. Had a life of its own there. So on the bottom right, you can see what Brian was talking about. There's a lot of heavy vehicles around, big vehicles in this community, and they work on them a lot. So on the outside of these clusters, outboard, we had work and parking spaces, but inside we have this existing vegetation landscape that comes through the site. So this we preserved, and this really is for gathering and play. And this is just in section to show you how that works. So this was also very, very important. If you don't design in accordance with the winter winds so that they can actually come across where you enter your house and scour that elevation so that snow won't build up, you can't get into your house. So we oriented so the west winds would do that. And then the summer wind comes through that shared landscape space. The sun as well was incredibly important. Just to put it in context, Fort Severn gets 18 hours of sunlight on the summer solstice and 7 on the winter solstice. So the houses are zoned. Where you spend your day is always on the south, the living rooms and dining rooms and so on. And the sleeping rooms are on the north, where you don't need the light. The pitch of the roofs was designed to exclude the sunlight in the summer and to draw it in the winter. And I won't go through this in detail, but there was a huge amount of work spent on this because these houses tend to be overcrowded. You've got the wood stoves cooking. You've got to basically design an envelope that can deal with high humidity and a high level of insulation, and could be also constructed by the local crews. And this is just a view of one of the elevations with one of the traditional smokehouses. I'm going to turn it back to Brian for the last slide.
Yeah, this is again, as Shirley was saying, a shot at night that really has this very kind of interesting light emulating from it, and we're really we're really interested in offering this new type of housing that that's building on what they're doing currently, but also taking into consideration things like providing outdoor zones for the kids, providing something that was technically strong, that would be built to last. So we're really happy to have had this experience, to work with the community, to maybe point some direction for the future for them. And we're working hard to try to find the funding to get this project built. So really excited about it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Brian, Shirley, thank you very much for that presentation. It was very moving, it's very effective. I think we'd like to congratulate you on a kind of almost a sort of two architect initiative to do something in very unpromising circumstances, both geographical and financial and political. And I guess it shows actually that it is possible for architects to make a very direct contribution to social and community life on their own initiative. But I'll pass over to our panelists to perhaps ask questions or make comments. Vicky Richardson.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Brian and Shirley. I really enjoyed that presentation, found it very moving, but also very, very interesting and informative. For me, it's a part of the world I don't know a lot about. And all the contextual information was really important for us to understand the kind of the sort of potential of the project, really. So really appreciate that. I mean, I wanted to ask, I was particularly interested in what you said about the relationship you formed with the community. I mean, it seems that that's really kind of at the heart of a project like this. And, the efforts that you went to understand the kind of the community in all kinds of ways, really, in terms of its existing building practices and traditions, but also in terms of its sort of democratic structure and the kind of the values, key sort of indigenous values that you described. I just wondered, could you say a bit more about that process of engagement and what were the key things that came out of that? Because I'm wondering whether often those processes here anyway, in our context, are sometimes quite superficial processes, one feels, that this is built into planning law, that you must consult and engage the community. And often we're talking about very superficial processes where really the key decisions have already been made, unfortunately, and it's really just a sort of box ticking exercise. I'm convinced that in your case that wasn't the case at all, but it'd be really interesting to know, what did that process tell you as designers? What kind of information? I mean, was it to do with the direction of the wind? You said the west wind blows away the snow, or the kind of the experience of living in a climate like that, or was it more to do with a sort of social values? I'm curious to know, was that a sort of key sort of fact-finding exercise for you? What did it bring to the design process?
No, I mean, absolutely. When we went to the community a couple of times for an extended period, and when we went the first time, we told them that we're here to listen, and that we'll be back, and we laid out our whole design process in a very transparent way, at the beginning. And when we first went there was some reluctance on their part. They tested us for a couple of days to make sure that we were going to be true to our word, and when we were, they really started to open up. The construction crews were quite guarded about how they were doing their current constructions and maintenance regimes. But by the second and third day, when they understood that we were there, to listen, to learn, to really understand, all of the challenges that they're going through, then the information really started to kind of pour out. And when we went back the second time, it was like, we were long lost friends, and they were glad to see us. And, we literally got hugs when we showed up on job sites. So, I think that was really, really key, to build up that trust, but also to have an appreciation for, what they were currently doing, and to reinforce to them that what they were doing wasn't wrong. But how do we take it to the next level? How do we start to think about clustering the units to start to deflect wind and to try to make some stronger social spaces? So we really made that kind of decision-making process an extension of what they were currently doing, and I think that was really kind of the secret to the success of the project. Shirley, do you want to add anything?
If I could add, Lawrence Holland from our office went up with Brian, and it was, I think, 2-3 day trips, right, Brian? That you were up there, and that was an extraordinary experience for us to learn from Lawrence's experience. And the other thing I should mention is that the chief, Paul Burke, is terrific, and he's the one who put in the solar panels. I think he's quite ambitious for the town. And also, he's the one who came up with the program of needs, specifically for elders and young families, because right now they're multi-generational, crowded conditions they live in, which is unhealthy in every possible way.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I was just going to add to that part of it is, we were designing the apartment as an option for seniors, but I think we were also thinking about young couples that are getting together. There are a lot of the older housing stock that's occupied by seniors that don't really need the space. So we were really trying to be quite flexible with this prototype that we were developing. It was really going to address quite a wide range of scenarios for the extended families there.
Jeremy Melvin.
I think this is an absolutely fascinating project because it seems to me to go right to the core of what architecture is and what architecture can do. Because it seems to me one of the most sort of widespread characteristics of architecture is that it can deal with the most extraordinary abstractions, and sometimes that leads to the most egregious errors, both in design and in social action. But also, as we know, high quality architecture is always rooted in the place it's in its climate, in its topography, in its geology, and also in its community. And this project seems to me to encapsulate those two things. On the one hand, there's a certain amount of technical, perhaps construction management know-how in terms of using the skills and what is available locally, but also there's that. So that's both this local and general widespread phenomenon. But it seems to me that the issue here, and thinking about the broader applicability of this sort of approach, clearly this project is rooted in 47 First Nation and their needs and their location. But would it be possible to think about extending this approach to other areas where there's dire need for housing? I suppose particularly rural areas, but they might be in completely different locations across the world.
Yes, I think that actually was the idea. Brian and I have been trying to design a prototype for about 4 or 5 years now, Brian. And we've been helped by people in my office like Lawrence and Bruno Weber, and also very kind and generous and incredibly talented energy and building science envelope engineers. So everything that we looked at, it's interesting because there are 50 First Nations and they're all different. However, there are there are, 637 northern communities for First Nations, and they all share very similar challenges of location, climate, accessibility, affordability, and so on. So our thinking was, if we could make something very flexible and adaptable, you could actually apply this to other communities in Canada. Have different, different cladding. Some communities actually are quite skilled at concrete, for example. Brian was telling us. We had considered modular construction, modular panels, but that wasn't applicable here. But you could actually create a system like that. It just requires funding. And that's what's been really frustrating for us. We've been casting about trying to figure out that Chief Paul Burke really wants to build these, and it's just hard to get through the bureaucracy, quite honestly. But it could very much be adapted throughout the country.
Thank you.
And it was
Vicky?
it was kind of I was just going to say it was kind of interesting that the National Research Council initially wanted that. They wanted a housing prototype developed. It, as I said in the presentation, could be rubber stamped across Indigenous communities of the North, but we have a tradition of oral teachings, and to really design a solution for the different parts of Canada, you're really shortchanging yourself if you don't give yourself an opportunity to visit those communities, to listen to their stories, to understand, some of their history. By not giving yourself that chance, you're really, you're not really allowing the project to be all that it can be. So I don't really see consultation or engagement sessions as sort of checking a box. It's really, the whole kind of getting a chance to receive the oral history is a very important part of the design process, and it can't be shortchanged, and it can't be sort of typified across large geographic regions.
I can really see that from what you're saying. Can I ask another question, which I suppose brings it back to where we are now, in this kind of extraordinary pandemic world. I mean, I must admit, I know very, very little about Fort 7, but I did Google it before we sat down this afternoon, and an article popped up about the sort of the dangers for remote communities in terms of COVID and the ways that communities are dealing with it. And I suppose it's easy to forget for us city dwellers that in places like Fort 7 there is no hospital. I'm not sure what kind of community facilities there are for health, whether there's a cottage hospital or any kind of health infrastructure. But it'd just be interesting to know, I guess, in communities like that don't have the kind of public buildings that we take for granted in towns and cities. How does that change the design of housing? Housing then becomes more than simply a place to live, doesn't it? I mean, it becomes, homes become multifunctional places of care, places of education, places of social gathering. So I wondered, in terms of the prototype you're developing, how does the kind of, the typology of a home have to adjust to that situation? I mean, I suppose related to that, it would be interesting to know how this present situation is affecting a place like Fort 7, if you know anything about that.
Yeah, they've had to be quite militant, at the airport about people coming and going, and they have really had to impose some fairly strict travel rules. And it's interesting, the whole community gets much of their subsistence from one store called, the Northern Store. And it's really, you can kind of think like the general store from the old days. So you don't have any choice. You have to go there to buy your food. There's only one place to shop, and there's one elementary school that really serves the whole population. So are these these 4 or 5 kind of focal points where the community gathers really out of necessity. So it'll be interesting to see some of the protocols that they're going to have to employ, in the future to address any kind of future outbreaks. But it's a huge problem, and it's occurring all across Canada.
Yeah, if I could maybe add, and correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, because this information comes from the newspapers. But early on, it was clear that all these 637 communities, in Ontario, all the communities, about 50 of them, were incredibly vulnerable to COVID. It would be an absolute unmitigated disaster. There are 500 people that live in Fort Severn. So it was imperative that they be vaccinated against COVID. So there's a group here called the Orange Air Ambulance, a medical group, and they worked with all the community leaders and the chiefs, and there were community volunteers, and the chiefs did an incredible job. They organized, the government set vaccines aside specifically for this very early on, and they organized it so they flew the doctors in, and nurses in, the community was there, they were all willing to have their vaccines, and it was incredibly effective, actually. So I think that's what I read. Anyway, Brian, is that correct?
Yeah, a lot of the Indigenous population were all received their second vaccine, quite early in the process, as soon as they were made available, and they had to, right? Because if a case did find its way into those communities, they would be very, very susceptible to mass outbreaks. So,
and Vicky, they have a clinic, right? You'd asked about the healthcare. They have a clinic with nurses who rotate in for different, work terms kind of thing, work sessions. But just to give birth,
I suppose one of the sorry, Shirley.
Sorry.
Right. I was just going to say that one of the interesting things about this project is the extent to which some of the processes that were undertaken, you could see could be regarded as generic and could apply anywhere, but only on the basis that the desired outcome would be different in many places. So I'm thinking, for example, if you were to take this project and the funding came along, and actually you were writing a sort of a handbook for architects, not just in Canada, but actually anywhere where there might be some similar generic problems, i.e. extreme climate, small communities, affected by past political, social, economic discrimination or conquest, or combination thereof. I'm just wondering which bits of the process that you've been through so far do you think could be replicable across kind of anywhere, and which things are really specific? Because I'm picking up Jeremy's point here about the thing, I was also struck by part of the presentation is dealing with a whole series of issues that are entirely familiar to us here in London, which is too dense, multi-generational housing with poor ventilation. That's why the COVID outbreaks are disproportionately large amongst some communities. A question of thinking about downsizing, i.e. what are the implications of longevity for the disposition and the sharing of housing stock. These are big issues for all sorts of people. So I'm just interested in a way in the kind of the scope of your project, because with or without funding, you could probably write a great handbook now on the basis of your explorations in this very specific example.
It's fascinating. That's very insightful, Paul. It's fascinating you say that, because when Brian and I got together, I think we realized that we couldn't do this in a conventional process. We had to design a new process. And a lot of our energy went into that and researching the conditions. And I really do think, I hope you agree, Brian, that this could be applied to urban conditions, to many, many different places. The outcomes would be different, but to us also, because these communities there's a kind of out of sight, out of mind thing in southern Canada. People don't think about what's happening up north, and it's appalling. That community consultation and designing something that really meets their needs was crucial to us. Brian, do you want to add?
Yeah, it is interesting. As I said in the presentation, we were one of 5 teams that got allocated, a site to take a look at. There were other communities we looked at in British Columbia, some of the other provinces. It's kind of interesting to take a look at the work that was produced by those 5 different teams to see, some of the things that were similar, some of where they got tweaked a little bit to really kind of fine tune a little bit more with the local community. I won't get into too much detail, but there was one of the other projects that was based in British Columbia where they have a large kind of forest industry. So the solution that they came up with really employed a lot of the local lumber that was readily available to them. But I think all of them really looked at the things like directionality, where the sun comes up, where the sun goes down, trying to work with prevailing winds. So really that whole idea about trying to align with natural forces, I think, is something that transfers and could become part of a playbook if one was developed. I also think, getting an inventory of what the skill set is in each community and what resources they have, what equipment do they have, what labor force do they have in which different trade disciplines, and really kind of like, licking your finger and kind of sticking it up into the air and really try to get a feel for the assets that they have, and then designing around that, I think is really key would be key to any kind of like handbook that would be developed.
Thank you. Because Jeremy, it is the case, there's something about the context that you need to understand in order to bring about any successful design or construction, particularly for poor communities, which go way beyond the technical business of designing a home. And we've talked earlier today about the sort of multiple contexts where actually, if architects have a skill which is particular to them, isn't it something to do with synthesizing these different requirements and almost working out what you need to understand before you leap into design detail?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I wish more architects recognised that, because there's a tendency among architects to say, I'm going to solve the problems of the world and here is how I solve the window detail. And I think that cuts out the whole process of how you get from the starting point to the end point. Architects are, on the whole, and that's why this project is refreshing, but on the whole, architects are rather bad at explaining that, even though some of them go through quite sophisticated internal mental operations to do it. But I think what's interesting here is that, in a sense, you've rescued architecture from its darker nature, because I was going back when Brian, you were talking about these residential homes where children were extracted and forced into, a sort of Western belief system, Western lifestyle. And that is actually very close to what happened when social housing started to be provided in London in the 19th century. People like Octavia Hill, great, in many ways, great hero of trying to deal with the problems of housing poor people in London. But what she did was impose middle-class lifestyles on poor people, which were not necessarily appropriate. And there were two overriding beliefs, which was that, left to their own devices, poor people would drink too much alcohol and would commit incest. And the whole nature of housing design was to prevent those two things. So you don't provide any alcohol provision either through pubs or off-license shops within a community or within a certain distance of a community, and you provide units for families, and these are almost all social housing provision in the UK was based around a sort of concept of a nuclear family of two parents of different sex and two children, and obviously the children were their sex was random, but you always had a 3-bedroom home, so you separated children by gender. And this was all about, preventing incest as well as, the wider issues of preventing alcohol. Now, we may say that in many ways those were enlightened things to do at the time, but they were evidence of the assumptions that were made by people like Octavia Hill, coming from a privileged group in society, about how people in a less privileged group should live. And I think this is very much what I call architecture's dark nature, is that it's about imposing lifestyles on people. But you've rescued it by saying, look, these people in First Nations communities have their own lifestyle, which are often far more appropriate for those communities and those locations than anything that could be dreamt up in London or Toronto or Vancouver. And let's learn from them about how they live and how they aspire to live. And it may be that we could learn from them in how we provide urban housing as well.
Yes, there's that sort of that phrase to describe the worst sort of, not necessarily architects, but anyone who's telling other people what's good for them, which is all transmission, no reception. And I think what was very refreshing in your presentation was to hear the extent to which you'd undertaken a kind of listening project with the people you were talking to, rather than what the federal government had done in the 1950s from your account, which is basically saying, well, you need housing, here it is. The man from Toronto knows best. Vicky?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of, it sounds as if there was a really strong kind of sense of partnership between you as architects and the community, and that, they were your client, really, in the way that we take for granted in situations where you have a wealthy client who engages an architect. You take for granted a kind of relationship of mutual respect in that situation, but so often in social projects, that kind of client-architect relationship is not there. Maybe because the actual client is the developer or the local authority, possibly. But the client is not seen as the community often, and so you don't get that kind of respect. I mean, I think another problem is that unfortunately many communities aren't the sort of resilient kind of strongly well-organized kind of communities that you've been working with. I mean, I think that sounds like a sort of a rather different situation than you might find in many cities, where unfortunately I think communities have been quite sort of battered and neglected, and are not those don't have a strong sense of self, as in representation, social coherence, and a strong sense of sort of resilience in that kind of way. People have been abandoned. In a city, communities, even though the word community is thrown around all the time, you don't really have communities anymore, I'd argue, which makes that sort of thing very different. I think architects, sometimes have a real will to engage with the community, but they struggle to find representatives, and they struggle to make those processes meaningful. And when I mentioned before this sort of tick boxing exercise, I actually think many architects working in the field of housing are really well intentioned, but they're struggling with to actually relate to a community that has just been so neglected that it's difficult to have that kind of proper sense of partnership that I think you've clearly had.
Well, I don't think it's overly cynical to say that certainly here in the UK and certainly in other countries, where as soon as politicians start talking about communities, they're going to ignore them. I mean, we've had 30 years of nonsense from politicians here, and almost everything about communities in London has been smashed up. There isn't sufficient housing. There isn't, the cultural identity of whole areas has been demolished because of real boundary reorganisations, political infrastructure changes. And you look round for communities that existed 50 years ago, they've all gone. The only thing that remains is lots of speeches about how we're doing everything for the community, but unfortunately it involves shutting the local library, shutting the local small hospital, shutting the local police station, so everyone's got to travel 20 miles to find these sorts of amenities. And I suppose in these unpromising circumstances, what is it that architects can do? Well, they can sort of put up a fight in the circumstances where they have the possibility of doing so. And I suppose, Jamie, that actually housing is probably one of the few building types where architects feel it personally because they all live in one themselves. And there's a sort of strength of engagement where all the time you see architects trying to do better for the potential users. And the question is whether the clients are up for the task of actually your proposition here at Fort 7 is where housing becomes part of cultural identity. It's not the provision of housing as infrastructure, it's the provision of housing as essential to the nature of those people.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right, and I fear that the sort of process of urbanisation and the responses to the most obvious problems of urbanisation in the 19th century were to separate out a lot of those functions. And Vicky made an interesting point that in Fort 7 it seems that these homes are going to have to do more than just be living space. They're going to have to be caring spaces, they're going to have to be educational spaces, which of course we've seen with the pandemic, people spending more time at home across the world. But I think what we've done is to separate out those functions into public institutions and private homes. And the private homes, actually both have suffered from that, but I would say particularly the private homes have suffered from that by being reduced and reduced and reduced, not just in size, but also in the amenities and the delights that they might be able to offer.
Well, I think another interesting thing about your presentation was the extent to which your housing proposition is a house is not just a home, that actually is a kind of part community environment, has a relationship to multi-generational living, and because of relatively limited public facilities, a whole series of things are likely to take place in the house, learning, etc., which makes the space and the volume and the ventilation even more important than if it was simply a dwelling. I mean, Vicky, did you feel this about the about this capacity of homes to be really fluid in their function?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing is that you've done this study, in incredible detail and level of sophistication, but the design that you've come up with is incredibly simple, and I think what's fascinating about this discussion as well is how much we can relate to what you're saying and see our own situation in the particular circumstances that you've described. I mean, one of the things I was thinking is, about what the architect can bring. I think what the architect brings is a sense of vision often, you know, and the ability to be able to step away from the situation and bring the best knowledge that we can muster, you know, from across our sort of profession, from our professional world, and bring that to bear and bring that into a relationship with the local knowledge and the local skills. So that combination can be incredibly powerful, actually. And I think it's the architect's sort of duty to bring a sense of vision and ambition for the future, because if architecture about anything, it's about showing an alternative, better future, isn't it? And I think that's why your presentation can be very powerful in terms of, you know, on the practical level, raising funds to be able to convince others to invest in this future, that it can be transformative. So, yeah, I mean, I think all architects share that in a sense, but I think an obvious thing to state is that a lot of these issues are fairly universal, aren't they? It's not very popular to say that these days, because we're supposed to emphasize difference.
But so in terms of social equity, one would hope that decent housing would be a right rather than a privilege. And you know, in vast sectors of society, that's simply not the case. Jeremy?
I think that's absolutely right, and it seems to me that the provision of socially equitable housing depends on the architect's near, I won't say absolutely, but near unique ability or combination of abilities to select, abstract and project. You know, select the best practice, best ideas from wherever they come, within a community or outside a community, to abstract, in other words, to understand how different sets of ideas might be fitted together, and to project that into a future which might last 7 generations. I think that's a very interesting point, because 7 generations equates to about 200 years, and I don't think there are very many residential buildings in UK being built that where the lifespan is expected to be 200 years.
Yes, interesting, isn't it? I mean, Georgian housing has sort of done it.
With a lot of care, a lot of TLC. But 100 years was the length of a typical lease, so that was really the design life.
I'd like to bring you guys in perhaps for a final comment on, although this has been a tough project and an emotional project, tell us something that is kind of, I think there are kind of some elements of joy or surprise or delight in this whole story. I wonder if you might like to say what it's given you, in a sense, being involved in it.
Do you want to go first, Brian?
Well, that's kind of difficult to answer that succinctly. The thing that I would probably value the most would be the friendships that I've made over the course of the last couple of years or so with the chief, with some of the trades people that are working in the community, with the nurses at the community health center, with the principal at the school, like all of those people that we really got to know and become friends with. So that's one thing. And I'm also I'm interested in the next project up there. When we heard their stories almost to a person, everyone said their most favorite time of the year was when they got to travel up the coast 5 or 6 hours for a month, usually in October, November, around that time of the year, to do their seasonal goose hunt, to really be on the land for an extended period of time. The schools closed down. So I thought, wouldn't that be great for the next project to be a bit of an exercise on what one of those camps might look like, something that was very light on the land, something that really kind of harkened back to their nomadic lifestyle, what materials would we use. So that's another thing that I've taken away as being very valuable, is it's given me the chance to kind of think about how we could help them further and really reinforce their relationship to the land and land-based learning. So we talked a little bit about that, and hopefully that's something that happens, soon, fairly soon. Want to try to keep some of this
Wonderful.
momentum going. Yep.
And
Shirley?
I think for
Thank
me,
you. And Shirley?
for me, it's actually given me hope. The whole period of the residential schools and the way in which First Nations were treated and put in these supposedly temporary accommodations, where they still live now in these communities, has been widely accepted to be cultural genocide in Canada. And I think it's, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission led by Murray Sinclair, who's the Honourable Murray Sinclair, who is First Nations himself, an amazing person. I think we feel acutely now in Canada that we are in a process of reconciliation. And I think also with reconciliation has to come restitution. And the conditions, I think what was so interesting about this project was the conditions are so extreme that it forces you to think very kind of in a very focused way. There's an American activist architect whose name is Brian Lee Jr., who says behind every social injustice, there's an architecture that supports it. And so we knew there was lots of evidence for that in all those northern communities. The southern houses that develop mold, and it just goes on and on. So we knew we had to do something directly in opposition to that. And I think we were able, through this project and the research we did for years before, is to actually figure out a process and a design direction that could be broadly applied. And that kind of gives me hope.
Thank you very much. Well, you should probably be designing a housing policy for the government and the authorities, taking on board some of those admirable aspirations. I'd like to thank Jeremy Melvin and Vicky Richardson here in the studio. We'll be returning in a couple of minutes to talk about this year's World Architecture Festival future projects and some of the statistics around them and which countries have produced the most entries and that sort of thing. But in the meantime, I'd like to thank very much Shirley Bloomberg and Brian Porter for a really inspirational talk. Thank you so much for your time, and the best of luck with this project, wherever it may take you, and good evening from London.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.